begin.
All right, hello and welcome. We are so excited to present this artist talk with Anila Quayyum Agha. On behalf of the students, staff, and volunteers at the IU Eskenazi Museum of Art, thank you for joining us. My name is Maddie Cook. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a museum host and student studying art history and studio art. First, we wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington was built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. At this time, the IU Eskenazi Museum of Art would like to thank our National Advisory Board Chairman Greg and Judy Somerville and National Advisory Board member Linda Watson for their immense generosity in supporting the Curator of Contemporary Art position. Greg, Judy, and Linda, thank you for all that you do for our museum. For those of you who are curious to ask questions, we invite you to submit questions by typing into the Q&A, which is located in your Zoom toolbar, typically at the bottom of your screen. Here are a few tips for optimizing your experience today. There are several ways to adjust the size of images on the screen. If you're connecting from a PC or laptop, at the top of your screen, look for View Options. Click on View Options to select settings that work best for you. The vertical bar between the slides and the speaker slides left and right to make the presentation slides or the speaker bigger or smaller. And for those of you connecting from a phone or iPad, you may be able to enlarge images by pinching the screen. Live closed captioning is available for this program. This can be turned on from your Zoom toolbar. We also do want to let you know that this program is being recorded. With me today are Elliot Reichert, Curator of Contemporary Art at the Eskenazi Museum of Art, Laura Shepper, Public Experience Manager, and Anila Agha, the Eskenazi Museum of Value students, and I have the great privilege of introducing the visiting artist. Anila Quayyum Agha, born in Lahore, Pakistan, received her BFA from the National College of Arts in Lahore and an MFA from the University of North Texas. Recent solo shows include the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, the National Sculpture Museum in Valladolid, Spain, the Dallas Contemporary Art Museum, Cincinnati Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville, Florida, Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, and the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio. For the 2019 Venice Biennale, Agha was included in a collateral event, She Persists, with 22 contemporary feminist artists. Agha has received the Efremsum Art Fellowship, Cincinnati Art Museum's 2017 Sheely Prize, and Dehan Artist of Distinction Award. Her 2014 Art Prize entry, Intersections, earned the Public Vote Grand Prize and split the Juried Grand Prize in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In 2017, she was awarded the Glenn W. Irwin Jr. MD Research Scholar Award by Indiana University. Recently, Agha received an endowed chair position titled Professor Morris Eminent Scholar in Art at Augusta University in Georgia, as well as the prestigious Smithsonian Fellowship in the Arts for 2021, and will be working with museums in Washington, D.C. in May of 2021. Her work has been collected by both institutions and private collectors nationally and internationally. Please join me in welcoming Anila Quayyum Agha. Anila Quayyum Agha, sorry about that.
Thank you so much. I'd like to say thank you to all three of you, Laura, Elliot, and Maddie. But I'd also like to thank both Elliot Reichert and David Brenneman for collecting my work that is part of the Ashkenazi Museum of Art now, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anila. So today's program is formatted in a conversation style. So I'm going to invite Maddie to share the first question.
In what ways, if any, has your identity played into your artistic practice?
Well, I was born and raised in Pakistan, and I moved to the United States in my 20s. And, when I was going through my slide presentation, I realized that, one gets older and one doesn't realize that one is getting older. So I feel like, I wanted to look at this photograph and realize how much I've grown, as well as, accomplished over the last 20 years. I feel like when I came to the US, I always knew I wanted to continue working as an artist. But I thought that the best way to start doing that would be to go back to school. And so when I started grad school at UNT, I realized that many of my professors didn't really know where I came from, or what that part of the world really contributed to the rest of the world and its art collecting situation. And so my first desire was to start making people understand where I come from. And then the second thing that really made me want to work on it was that I wanted to represent women who have often been eliminated through history, especially women artists. And so that was my second kind of desire, or my real impetus. And so much of my beginning work was kind of creating this, two-dimensional work that was really about women and how their work is often not appreciated or even collected, or but then there were sub elements to the work itself, because I was very interested in sort of like thinking about how a two-dimensional surface could have more interesting ways to approach. And so when I was in grad school, I was starting to think about, like, what is it that makes this work mine? And I realized that I'd learned how to sew and use a sewing machine very early in my life. My mother taught me how to stitch when I was like 5, maybe. And I received a sewing machine very early in my life as well. So I was like very interested in trying to explore what that meant in my part of the world. And it occurred to me that my mom, when I was quite young, she would gather a lot of women from the neighborhood to make quilts together. And they would all sit in a circle and they would stitch, the quilts together by hand. And I would slide under the quilt and I would play around it and stuff like that. And I realized that the women talked about their families when they were doing that. And it often was, the discussion was part of their, personal lives, but also how they are perceived by the husbands and, the society and the culture. And it was often that they were not given much of a place in society. And so it made me feel like I wanted to address that. And then I started looking back in my own life and I realized that often I'd also been made to feel like I wasn't as important as the male counterparts to me in that society. So my desire was to kind of also reflect the lack of literacy that kind of creates this situation there. And so initially it was more about like dealing with the subcontinental kind of situation, but also my displacement from there. Of course, it was made by choice, but it was still a very real sense of loss that one faces when you move across the world and go somewhere else. And I think I wanted to put that in the work as well. So a lot of it comes from Pakistan. I think it reflects a lot of my my cultural interpretation of what it feels like there versus here in the United States. So I think my work really kind of deals with contradictions in a real sense.
Thank you, Anila. It's the photography of those stitched works, I know, doesn't do justice to what they're like in person. I've been lucky to see several of them, and I think you've wrapped a lot of incredible themes into this kind of density of your work, which I find really compelling. Which is, you make very beautiful things, but the thematics, the political, the structural, the social concerns, the gender concerns are really complicated. but you're able to sort of produce these beautiful objects. So we are very lucky to have a work in your collection called A Flight of 1,000 Birds. And I was very happy when I first arrived to be able to install in our museum, among other works that really, I think, connect to the questions of identity and hybridity that are really in your work. But we have an image on the screen that is also relevant to that, which is this piece, This Is Not a Refuge. And so I know we have some images later of Flight of 1,000 Birds, but I'd love for you to talk about this project. It's a very compelling, and how it might relate to what we've acquired in the museum.
Well, when you think about how people have populated this country, much of it has been populated by immigrants. And I think the work in your collection, The Flight of 1,000 Birds, as well as this work, and there's another piece that you're going to see as well, they really generated because of the previous administration here, the government that we had with President Trump and his cohorts. And it occurred, right at the start, it started seeming to be a situation where immigrants were being maligned. And I kind of looked at my last 20 years of living in this country. All I've done is contribute in multiple ways, like through teaching, but also living in a wholesome, good manner. And it just really offended me to kind of feel that we, as the immigrants, even though everybody almost else is an immigrant other than the native peoples of this nation, it seems so arbitrary to malign one sector of the population, so you could, almost like shoot from behind it in a sense. And it made it very political to me. And I felt like, refugees are not something that we can hide, and refugees or immigrants we cannot discard. And we also should not malign them, because many refugees or many immigrants have contributed tremendously to this country. And so I wanted to make this project that kind of reflected on that ideology. But in this particular piece, it's an outdoor project, and I was participating in this exhibition of Biennale in Kansas City that Dan Cameron organized. And I wanted it to sort of be like in a place where you could see it from a long distance off. And it has a light at night, but the sun also shines through it during the day because the entire piece is cut out. And I wanted it to sort of reflect the idea that, refuge from a distance looks really beautiful, but maybe when you get inside or get closer to it, you realize that there's no real comfort or a real sense of togetherness because of the cutouts. So, and then it makes it very public too. And so we as people are always in the public's eye. As immigrants, we are constantly being monitored. And so it seemed to me that this structure being a European house or an American house structure would talk about refuge, but then you can't really have refuge because it's open to the elements like snow and sleet and heat and everything. And but I wanted to put a door in it because I wanted to kind of think about the fact that there's the need to have agency for everybody to be able to improve their lives and improve the national lives of everybody. The citizenship should be about ethics and, togetherness and, like a comprehensive way to deal with our lives together. And so the subsequent project that I did of this series doesn't have a door, because towards the end of Trump's administration, it seemed like the agency was slowly being taken away. And then coming back to the Flight of 1,000 Birds, I wanted to use a tile that I had found at the Alhambra, but it's also very common to, the shape that looks like a boomerang. It felt like a bird structure to me. And it also kind of reflected the idea that birds travel, they migrate from one part of the world to the other as the seasons change. And it's a very natural kind of flight. And why do we call people who migrate like that bad? And so this piece was generated from that, but also the fact that, it occurred to me while I was thinking of this project, that many of the refugees right now are brown people who may be from the southern hemisphere of the world. And much of the refugees in Europe were Muslim origin or Islamic origin. And so it seemed like an appropriate thing to use the tile from that part of the world, but also the fact that the interior section is very flower-like. It's got that beautiful, and then the shadows are like metaphors that they kind of create this synergy that keeps growing outwards and ripples and ripples. And so that was what I wanted to kind of convey with this work, but it's also, sort of like a homage to Robert Irwin, because he was the first person who did those disc pieces that are really quite beautiful, and they have this light and shadow that makes it almost like they are together. The shadows work together with the piece itself. But in my work, I wanted to kind of create a more feminine aspect to it, make it more beautiful. And the reason why I like to do everything just so it's perfectly aligned and the craftsmanship is really good, is because I kind of feel like, the concept of beauty in the East and the West is very different. The concept of beauty in the East is sort of like, you have to have beauty around you to have serenity and to have a level of engagement with nature and all that. And so this piece also reflects that part of the world in that way, because I'm constantly battling with this idea of like beautiful is banal versus beautiful can be sublime. And so this piece really deals with that ideology as well.
Thank you so much. It's actually because when that work came into our collection, I spent a lot of time thinking about it in relationship to the historical objects in our collection, and of course we placed it around Persian, Sasanian, and other kind of parts of a larger tradition of decorative arts. But your work is, I mean, it's a stunning, visually stunning piece. And I don't think there are moments in my brain that's like, oh, MC Escher, like that kind of echoing of form that I really appreciate. And then the idea of diaspora, right, which is that the work literally kind of ripples out into other parts of the world. So there's a center, and then these other kind of ripples that I think are really compelling. So yeah, I'm actually gonna have to go down and maybe rewrite that didactic for that piece because it's what you just shared is really really compelling to me. So thank you. And I think Maddie might have a question right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was wondering, what are your inspirations or influences, and what did you see that moved you more into installation work?
Well, when I was in graduate school, that was like the start of the 21st century. It was 2000 onwards. And I remember at that time, I didn't feel like there was any real discussion around installation art. And then the first time I saw that it was something that I could even try my hand at was because there was a visiting artist by the name of Wenda Gu who was invited to the UNT. And he created this project in the atrium gallery that was completely made from glue and human hair. And it was this beautiful piece that came from all the way from the top, about 30 feet down, and came all the way down so you could actually look at it. And it was just that. And it blew my mind. I was like blown away thinking that this is something I could maybe think about. So I tried my hand at one installation during graduate school, and I wasn't very successful with it, I don't think, but it was the start of that. And then when I started my job at the Heron School of Art and Design at IU in Indianapolis, I realized that that was something I could test because now I had space, a paycheck coming in, and I had the access to more interesting environment since I was teaching as well. And I was able to travel quite a bit starting when I started at Heron. So every year I would travel somewhere. And on my first travels, I went to London to explore that area because of colonialization. I was very interested in seeing how those people, Britain lived with South Asian people who was like, my homeland. And so when I was there, I was able to see a very interesting show at the Tate Turbine Hall by Olafur Eliasson, and it's called The Sun. And that, again, blew my mind a second time. I was like, wow, this is even possible, because what he did was something really simple, but it wasn't simplistic. It was simple materials. He just lined the entire roof of the turbine hall, which is about the size of a football field, I think, or at least it felt like that to me, with mirror. And then he put a light on one end of it that looked like the sun because it was reflected into the mirror above. And I noticed coming down from the top floor, down the stairs into the turbine hall, I was like struck by how people were, participating in that piece. And it wasn't just something you look at and walk away. It was like you were participating in that work. I noticed people were having picnics down there. They were laying down, they were dancing, they were running. Children and families were together. And I thought like, oh my God, I can make this work like my work. What if I were able to do this? But, for a long time, I think, and this is something that I notice in my own practice, that I ruminate on ideas for a while before I actually put them into plan. But when I came back, I noticed that I had started making installations, and this piece that you're seeing on the screen is titled My Folk Tongue. And this was actually around the same time that I built this piece. It reflected my country, but also the fact that the neighborhoods, meaning the different countries together used to be one at one time. So our language was very common. And so I wanted to use, because, I speak Hindi and English and Urdu. So I used the three languages in this piece so I could kind of physically demonstrate how we can make it impossible for people to move into a place when you don't understand the language, or there are barriers to cultures. And so this piece represented that feeling of like how India, Pakistan, and Britain used to be like together, or at least Britain had colonialized us, but it was part of that country now. And but it also created many barriers for people who live there, who move elsewhere. So, when I moved to the United States, I spoke English, but people often wouldn't understand what I said because I had a different accent. But I spoke just as well as other people. And so it seemed to me like, interesting to create that work. And I wonder if I touched upon all of the parts to your question.
I believe so. That was really, really cool to hear about Olafur Eliasson's son. I've studied that in the past, and I always thought it would be so amazing to see that. So it's really cool to hear from someone who has been there what it was like. I remember that was like early piece of when I started studying art history that like I was like, wow, this is like seems so amazing. I was also wondering if you could tell us a bit about rites of passage and your work towards women's rights as human rights.
Well, like as I mentioned in the beginning, I was very drawn to explaining myself to the world when I started in the United States, because I often felt misunderstood or not heard. And over the years, I realized that, in the beginning, I was really quiet. I didn't really say much because I was so hesitant in airing my own voice. But I realized that many, many immigrants live with that fear. And in the last 2-3 years, you've realized, this nation has realized how important it is to have equity for all people. And so my interest was to kind of depict the accomplishments of women. And this piece, the rites of passage, was kind of like a rites of passage for me, as well as a rite of passage for the women in my own country. Because when I went on a trip to Pakistan one time, I was able to visit this amazing I don't know what you would call it, but it's a really large medieval graveyard that is has carved headstones, and the graves themselves are carved out of limestone and other and they're all motifs that depict men, and not so much women, but men and women. And the symbols that you would find for the men were often like swords and shmirars and like big shields, and the women only had these little patterns that represented jewelry. And it seemed to me like I am going to make it larger than life. And so I made 100 pieces, and this is an installation that kind of sits together, and it only represents the women who may have been forgotten because their only remembrance is really what they did for the men. And so my thought was to kind of elevate their work and elevate them through this project. It took me I think it took me a year to build this piece, and it was very therapeutic, I would say, for me.
It's a really beautiful project, and there's a depth to it that I hadn't realized, I think, earlier in looking at it. I know we have another bunch of images, and I thought it would be helpful to move to them because one, they're really stunning, and I think I would love for you to talk about these larger installations. I think you're well known in the art world and in the broader world for these massive lantern structures that you've installed in different ways. And so, what drove you toward these kind of larger installations, and if you could just explain that process a little bit more, that'd be really wonderful.
So, if you look at the cities that we live in the West or the East, most of the cities are architecturally designed by men, and women are often not very comfortable in those public spaces. And that was something that I kind of dealt with in my own way when I was living in the United States, but also when I was living in Pakistan. But on one of my travels, I decided to visit Spain, and Alhambra in Granada is a fabled Islamic city that people from the entire Islamic world know about. Children are told about it when they're little. So that was one of the places I had decided that I was going to visit. And when I was there at the Alhambra, it occurred to me how wonderful this space is. It's got pattern, it's beautiful, yet it feels like this place is spiritual in some ways. And as I was walking around, and I may attribute this feeling to my being hungry, I think, slightly lightheaded, but in my head, I started thinking about how I would like to create a space that is just as beautiful, has the same kind of sensibility as the Alhambra, and yet it would be from a woman's perspective, and it would be created so that anybody who walks in, gender-wise or caste or race, would feel comfortable, because I wanted to create a space that would make everybody almost the same. So as you're moving around, the shadows would become like part of you, and you would become part of it. So your body creates another shadow that changes the design of the wall into something else. And so it was like an idea. And initially I had visualized it to be just above our heads. But as I and my engineer started talking about it, he kind of mentioned, Steve Prachel is my engineer, but also my partner now. And we worked together very extensively. And Steve had done all this preparatory work for the ceiling piece that I had visualized in the beginning. And so he said to me, Anila, we are not going to have enough money to make this piece because we are running out of money. And so as I'm listening to him, I'm like thinking, okay, so why don't we turn it into a cube? Then we could have the light everywhere and it'll work. He got really mad in the beginning, but then as he started thinking about it, because he felt like, all his time was going to be wasted, except that as he started thinking about it, he realized that it's actually going to work. And so my initial thought, after I kind of did the cube and I kind of thought about all the different sub layers that you can see in this piece, were that it's light and dark. It turns the gallery into the art itself. Anybody who is in there becomes part of the art. And it creates this very interesting ambiance that helps people communicate with themselves introspectively, but also allows people to sort of feel happiness, and yet they're able to, so they accept each other. I've seen people who walk in there often hush their voices down and they'll speak in whispers. And it was a very interesting sort of thing that happened. And this piece, I wanted to put this image in there as well, because I wanted to show you, this is done by Third Space in Indianapolis. And what they were trying to do was to create a different way of learning for young children. This is done in a school, elementary school. And it was sort of like an intervention where people would be able to, children would be able to think like, what are some of the catalysts that make an impact on you, like the Alhambra made on me. And so it was a wonderful experience. There was this little girl, anecdotally, I'll tell you, who kind of attached herself to me. She must have been 7 at the most, I would imagine. And she would hang on every word that I would say. And she would run around me and show me the design that she had made. And I felt like, if nothing else, one little person has really benefited from this. It was a wonderful experience. And to continue, I can talk about this a little more because, the real impetus to create this work was to create a space that is very feminine. And that really came from this idea of like, when I was living in Pakistan, public space was not mine. And also, to be able to pray in a mosque was also not allowed culturally to women because, men wanted to protect their women, so they would mostly keep them inside their homes. And so our prayers were also conducted inside our homes. And so when I was visiting the Alhambra, I was also kind of thinking about this thing that I'm like looking around myself and thinking, nobody's chasing me out. But this feels very much like Pakistan because, much of the artwork that I saw around me at the Alhambra is common to other places in the Islamic world as well, and also Pakistan. And so my thought was like, I want to create this space that didn't allow women to be participating in this space in the past. And just so I can explain this a little better, in a third world country, a mosque is not just a mosque to pray in, it's a community center. It's a place that is really like a museum as well. So people can come and see beautiful objects and the tiles and the carving. It can also represent a library. So it's not just a single faceted place. It's a place where the entire community came together, but 50% of that community was not allowed in there. And I just felt like I needed to make this space to reflect that idea.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you make a sculpture and then yet that sculpture itself kind of projects into a space and makes a space. It's almost a virtual space in a way because it is ephemeral and is sort of relegated to the light and the shadow. But I really appreciate that. I know Maddie had a question, and I can follow up with much more. But I would love to ask. I think Maddie, as a student, maybe you could.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have like any advice to give to like students, especially like students in the Masters of Fine Arts or just fine arts students in general.
Well, when I started grad school or when I was going to undergrad, I remember, let me backtrack a little. When I was going to undergrad, I remember one of my, our school was based on the British system where you would have it split in 2 terms. And through the first year was like a foundation year where you would, made to do every single aspect of a college in that way. So what, I spent time in the metal area, I spent time in woodworking, I spent time in drawing, sculpture. And as I was making one of the projects in sculpture, my sculpture teacher said, you should be a sculptor. And it didn't really, I listened to him and I moved on because I made a promise to my mom that I would study textiles because she was worried for me that I may not end up having any money in my later years. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna move on. When I spent time in Paris one time where I was studying fashion design, I was starting to think that maybe I wanna use my textile background and go into fashion. And there I spent time with this very important pattern maker who has worked with people like John Galliano and Dior. And so she also was teaching me how to do the pattern on a mannequin. And she said, Anila, I think you should be a sculptor. And I didn't pay attention to either of those people because I was like, I was stuck in my little thing. I made a promise to my mom. And so when I came to the United States, because I had traveled over here in a single suitcase, I decided that I didn't really have much of a, I couldn't make big sculpture. So I started the fiber program, and I went ahead and did my drawings and was quite happy with them. But I noticed later on that I'm actually adding sculptural aspects to my drawings because I was cutting them out, I was sewing on top of them. And I realized that right from the start, I was doing sculpture if only I paid attention earlier enough. So what I would say to students is always pay attention, because you could be doing something that could really be for the rest of your life. And attend what you're doing. And as an artist, pay attention to your surroundings, to your environment, to your politics, to the politics that are taking place in the country. Because the other thing that I realized very early on, and this was something I was familiar with because I had female teachers who would take us on protest marches when we were in undergrad, because at the time we had a martial law situation, and this person, this army chief, had taken over the country, and he decided to change some of the laws, and he came up with this law that actually made rape into adultery, and added that into that law that 4 women had to give witness for the rape to be accepted. I mean, you never have 4 people present when a rape is, or, you most often don't have 4 people present to give witness. So it kind of reduced the ability for women to give witness as a single person. You had to have 3 other women to advocate for you. And I thought that that was such a horrible thing to happen in a country that has 50% of women. And so that is also one of the reasons why I think human rights are women's rights. Human rights also include gender rights. And so I think paying attention to the politics of my country and then coming here and paying attention to the politics here helped me make the work more layered.
Yeah, that is the 4 witness thing is like a huge perversion of like Quranic law. I remember, which is, undergraduate intro to Islam. That's wild. I'm just, and we have a few audience questions coming up, but I want to just take my own time here. Your work is quite frankly quite beautiful.
Thank you.
And I say that as someone who knows that in the world of contemporary art, the world of that we both engage in, beauty is not necessarily like it's important, but it's not always the highest priority. And just I'm wondering, how do you think about the beauty that you produce in relationship to the politics, the gender issues? I mean, this is a way off script, but I'm looking at this image of All the Flowers Are For Me, read at the Cincinnati Art Museum. The title is poetic, the image is beautiful. How do you negotiate the relationship between beauty and a kind of deeper identity politics that you're obviously engaging in?
It's always hard because, when I was in graduate school, I was often told that my work is too beautiful and I'm like spending too much time making it too perfect. And it often occurred to me that, if you were familiar, like I would think about my professors and the other students who were not very familiar with, other parts of the world. And there was a real drive to make work that was more, Euro-Western style. And it always seemed to me that people are negating me and telling me that I should make work like them. And it was, I would use the word upsetting, but in context, at that time, it was fairly upsetting. But now that I think about it, it helped propel me in that direction even more, because I thought, instead of letting it go and making something that becomes very synonymous with everybody else's work, I'm going to go that route even more. So I wanted to create almost like this feeling of being on a knife edge, where beauty and spirituality kind of become the same. And in a way, it reflected the Eastern concept of beauty and what it means. We walk with nature, we don't try to conquer it. Or at least, if you look at Far Eastern and Eastern philosophy, that is often what it's promoted as. And in the West, you find that the earliest people, they try to conquer the natural environment, so it would be bent to their will. And I kind of sometimes thought that, that is almost like my environment is telling me that I'm not important. My work is not important. It has to reflect what everybody else is doing, because I'm an American now. And so I wanted to keep that aspect where I would make it really beautiful, make it knife edged, make it a number of other things, not just one. And so I continued to work in that direction. And I was like, I want to create something that makes me laugh and cry at the same time. And that is the reason why I also use poetic license in the titles, because I wanted to create a story in the viewer's mind. You can build your own story. You can look at the work and think of your own life and fit it into that paradigm. And nobody should feel alienated. And so that was like the impetus, but also the philosophy behind my practice, that I am going to show you who I am through my work, but also make you realize that other cultures are not something to be scared of. You can learn from them. We, as human beings, are all kind of together in this. As Kamala Harris, a vice president, has said in some of her speeches, that we kind of have to raise people together rather than keep them below us. And so I think that's how I try to do it. Sometimes I fall flat, of course, but sometimes the success is quite good. And so I just keep trying.
I think there's a huge amount of vulnerability, but also generosity in your work, and that they work together to produce that dynamic that you've just described. I'm remarking on the titles because they are quite poetic and they offer an entry point that's very personal, whereas the work can be kind of approached in so many different ways. But
well, the only title I couldn't come up with a good title was the intersection piece. I kind of thought about it as a production title, and I couldn't seem to change it because I kept thinking that it fits everything I'm trying to say. The intersection of cultures, the intersection of weight, height, concept. It was like the intersection of almost everything, like heavy, light and dark, delicate and fragility, yet it's really made of really heavy material. And so it kind of came across as like the perfect title, so I couldn't change it.
I muted myself. And thank you for that insight, because I think that's something that there are a lot of practitioners on the call and who are really thinking about their own work. But I invite Maddie, if you want to parse through the Q&A, because I have not been paying as close attention to it. I've just been engaged in the conversation we're having.
So we do have one participant who asked a couple minutes ago, like about education. We already talked a decent length about that, but seems to be asking specifically, like, aside from art, do you promote studies in small business management or advertising or engineering? And do you have any advice for students in general concerning those anywhere areas?
Well, I think that, the one thing that I would say to everybody is that work hard, because I worked so hard all my life, and I never think that anything should be given to me without the effort. I think the effort has to be 150% rather than 80% or 90%. And I also think that, yeah, some people get lucky and they make it big right away, like on Instagram, or they become influencers and stuff like that. But really, the majority of us have to work really hard. And I think taking a shortcut, thinking that that's going to get you ahead, often doesn't get you ahead. I think you have to kind of work through all of your content to get where you need to get, and in your time, you'll get there. Patience is something I would recommend to everybody, not just students. I think there was a moment in my life where I was thinking, I'm living in the US, and all the people in Pakistan, all the artists I know are making it really big because Pakistan suddenly exploded, and there are all these biennales, and people from my country were invited into these, like Rashid Rana and Shazia Sikandar, and all these people are making it so big. And I'm like thinking, my goodness, I'm being left behind. And so it made me really unhappy at that point in time. And this is like, I'm talking about like maybe 10, 15 years ago. And then I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to just do it at my pace. And I think that that's an important thing. One needs to be patient to give your voice the listening that it needs within yourself, but outside you too. And then if you see an injustice around you, speak up, don't hold it back. I think we have noticed in the past few years how important it is to speak up and be represented, but also to represent other people. And education should not be taken as something that's going to get you a job. It's to educate your mind and your environment. And so my suggestion strongly would be not to take a course that doesn't gel with you. Take courses that will make you a stronger person and follow your heart.
Thank you. We have another question asking, what is your proudest accomplishment?
My proudest accomplishments would be my son, of course, and then my stepson as well. Both of them are doing well, very proud of them. The other accomplishment is that, I set out with some goals. I made like a 20-year goal when I was still in graduate school, and some of them have been accomplished. So working with an idea was able to take me to that goal. And I would say that I feel very proud that I was able to accomplish them. And especially because I had no family here, my first go-to idea was to make sure I have the rent check, because I didn't want to be homeless. And so that was one of the reasons why I worked so hard, because I knew that if I look away, I may not have something to fall back on. I couldn't ask my family in Pakistan to send me money. They didn't have enough. And so it was always this thing of like, be vigilant, be patient, but be vigilant. And I paid attention later. Maybe I should have done it when I was in undergrad, but continued to do it later. And I'm happy about that. Yeah. And one other thing I'd like to add, I think Also, the students should always think how they can add to the civic life. My way of giving back to my community has always been through my teaching. Be honest, be generous, be open-minded, listen to others, because sometimes if you listen, you may find that the world opens up.
We also have another, although your work evokes traditional imagery, your sculpture invokes computer-generated laser cutting. Could you say a little more about the intersection of old and new in your practice?
Well, I moved from the old country to the new country, so that was like my first innovation, I think. And then my second innovation would be, when I was writing the grant for the New Frontiers at the IU institution, I was really looking at what they had requested for the grant to be, and it was to kind of take your work into a new direction. And technology seemed like the perfect way to move in that direction, because there are many ways to make artwork that would be faster and much, obviously it misses the hand, but then the hand of the artist, but like it still gets the essence of the idea done so much faster. If I'd sat there and carved the intersection piece at the size that I wanted it to be, I could never have finished it in 10 years. And so it seemed like a no-brainer to me that I should, use technology to help me. And I continue to use it because it allows me to use material like steel that I may not be able to use on my, if I were making things only by hand. And I think that the 21st century looks very different for artists than it did in the 20th or the 19th century. And, when you look back at the Renaissance, those artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo were using their hand to do a lot of the work, but the communities were much smaller. Now we are reaching bigger and a wider audience, and I think that maybe use of technology is very important.
I think I will just say, I know we have to wrap up because we are on a kind of time scale that is pretty tight, but thank you so much, Anila. I really appreciate your generosity, your honesty, your thorough thinking through your own practices, the highs and lows and what you've discovered over time. So there's more in the Q&A that I would just say of like, where we are, you can get a hold of us and we can engage in that way. And also, Anila, you are going places, you're going many places. You're in Augusta right now and you're going to be in other places. But in terms of your relationship to the Eskenazi Museum, you're not going anywhere.
No.
So.
I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to explain my work. And also, I think of IU as my family. And so it's really important that Eskenazi Museum collected my work. And it's just such a proud moment for me. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anila. And I know we've got to wrap. And we'll talk more soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, thank you so much for talking with us today. And thank you to each of you who've joined us this evening. We hope you are all enjoying this program. We'd like to invite you to several upcoming programs. Next up in our Visiting Artist series, join us for a virtual artist talk with Ju Young Shin on April 1st. And then join us for a conversation about how the Eskenazi Museum of Art is thinking through questions of how to represent and display contemporary African art with curators Elliot Reichert and Allison Martino, and conversations on curating, exhibiting contemporary African art on April 15th. Upcoming during Women's History Month, we invite you to Art and a Movie, Queen of Hearts, with live conversation and Q&A with artist Audrey Flack and director Deborah Schaefer on March 11th. And we do want to say today's program and everything we do here at Indiana University, the Eskenazi Museum of Art, is made possible by philanthropy. We would like to especially thank our supporters for the museum's annual fund, which allows us to continue to provide these free programs to you all. So if you have enjoyed this event, please visit our museum website to make a donation. Gifts big or small make all the difference. Finally, we're wondering, how was your experience today? We appreciate your feedback to help make better experiences. You can tell us in an easy survey as you exit this webinar. And from all of us at the Eskenazi Museum of Art, take care and have a good evening.